I'm Catherine Epstein. I'm Dean of the Faculty, and I am a professor of history. So welcome to this panel, Diversifying the Faculty, Women and Racial Minorities. Thank you so much for coming, and you're in for a real treat. It's my great honor to introduce Buffy Aries, professor of psychology at Amherst College. Buffy is an amazing role model for all of us women faculty at the college. She was one of the first women faculty members, and she's a real pioneer. She's been at Amherst since 1975, just 1 year after the board voted to admit women, and before the first woman actually graduated from the college. So over the course of her career, Buffy has published some 30 articles as well as 5 books. 3 of her books have related to Amherst. In 2008, she published Race and Class Matters at an Elite College, which was followed by Speaking of Race and Class, the Student Experience at an Elite College. In these 2 books, Buffy followed the class of 2009 through 4 years of Amherst and beyond. She tells a sobering story about students of color and first-generation students at Amherst, and perhaps she will draw on this work in her talk today. In 1962, Rose Ulver came to Amherst as the first woman faculty member. As I'm sure you'll hear today, Rose was an extraordinary mentor for the first generation of women faculty at Amherst. In 2011, Buffy was the major organizer of a conference at Amherst about the first half-century of women faculty members at the college. She brought together former and current women faculty from 1962 to 1984, and the aim of the conference was to examine the first 2 decades of women on the faculty and to address the lessons the institution can learn from those women's experiences, particularly as applied to diversifying the college today. This was a wonderful conference. There were eyewitnesses there, women who had been at Amherst for a short period of time and then felt compelled to leave, so it was completely fascinating. In 2014, Buffy published Gender Matters, the first half-century of women teaching at Amherst, and that was co-written with Rose Ulver and Jane Taubman. Sadly, Rose died later that year, and when I was presented with one of the first copies of Gender Matters, I was delighted that I was still able to write a thank you note to Rose before she actually passed away. So the story that Buffy tells in that book is both disturbing and inspiring. To me, given this past, and it was not so very long ago, it's remarkable that the college now has a woman president. In addition, I am already the 3rd woman dean of the faculty, so I'm not, I'm number 3 in this row. So I would say Amherst has come a long way, but there's still plenty of progress to be made on many different fronts. So please join me in welcoming Buffy.
Let me see if this microphone is on. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much, Catherine, for the introduction. And what I wanted to do is begin by telling you how I, as a psychologist, got into the business of studying history, because our dean is a historian. But basically, the first women who taught at this college have long been forgotten. The dean of the faculty's office kept absolutely no records on them. The Office of Human Resources kept absolutely no records on them, and in the year 2000, when Amherst digitized its records, it entered only those faculty members who were currently teaching at the college. So that meant that essentially the first women who taught here, who'd come and gone, were lost to institutional memory. So as we got to the year 2011 and approached the year 2012, when it would mark 50 years of women teaching here, a few of us who had been here for 40 years almost, put our heads together to think about how to celebrate the occasion. And it struck us that we celebrate at this college coeducation, becoming a college that has men and women students over and over and over the decades. But no one had ever looked back at the history of the women teaching at this college, becoming a college with a faculty of both men and women. And so we thought we would mark the occasion by having a symposium and bringing back all those women who left. No easy task, because most of them had a pretty lousy time here. And some of them actually took Amherst off their visas. So part of our job was to entice them back. But the first job was, so before enticing them back, that was the idea, that to review this history. And it seemed an important moment in the history of the college to do that, because Amherst was undergoing a major wave of retirements. And the oldest cohort here that was retiring was predominantly white men. And as our student body had changed dramatically, and we had a huge increase in the number of, and the percentage of students of color, there was an interest in further diversifying the faculty and bringing in more faculty of color. So it seemed like there might be lessons to be learned from the early history of women who taught here that might be applicable to the new hires that were going to be made of faculty of color. So the first job was to figure out who these original women were, because there was no trace left behind. So essentially, I went into the college archives and started looking at the college catalogs, which list the faculty every year, and started putting together a spreadsheet for myself. Woman's name, okay. And then the next year, is that woman's name still there? And at a certain point, her name's no longer there. Okay, she left. And I started building a little map for myself of like the comings and goings of women. And we needed a cutoff point, and it was kind of arbitrary. We set it at 1983, which was the year that a committee was put together to look into the work conditions for women, because there was so much concern about the retention of women at this college and how badly we'd done at retaining all the women that we hired. So we held the symposium. Catherine was there. It actually was a very productive conversation. I mean, after all these years, like, women were looking back, and we had the collective wisdom of women looking back, and I think all of us came away with a deeper understanding of what had gone on during those years. And for some of the women, it was really a corrective emotional experience. I mean, because they had blamed themselves all these years for their failures here, and understood that institutionally things were going on that also contributed to things not working out for them. So I think it was an important occasion for them. And then we did think that it would be nice if this information reached a wider audience and put it together into a volume. And one thing that's included in that volume is biographies from all the first women who taught here. So if anyone here knew any of them, I mean, we tracked them down. We were able to collect biographies from a lot of them. We were able to track down 45 living women who taught in that first 20 years, and in addition, there were 7 who had passed away. And over half of them came back and took part in the symposium. So let me start briefly with this history. Starts in 1962 when Rose Olver gets hired. It's not as if in 1962 Amherst College made a decision to hire women. It was a complete fluke that Rose was hired. The way we hired back then is call up through the old boys network, people at Harvard, who you got. Rose's advisor says, Rose Olver. The chair of the psych department goes, I'm sorry, we don't hire women. Her advisor goes, why not? And I guess they didn't have a great answer, so they decided to interview her. So she gets hired, she gets the job, but over the next decade, only 5 more women would be hired. So it's not as if that, there were a few exceptions to the rule. It was still predominantly, almost entirely all male faculty. But then the situation changes by 1972, because these are the years, starting in the late 60s, when all the male schools were going co-ed. We were among the last to go co-ed of the male schools. And there was a report that came out from the Select Committee on Coeducation in 1972, and in it, the president, Bill Ward, argued that women should have an opportunity not just to attend Amherst College, but to serve on its faculty. And the hiring of women at that point began in earnest. So between 1972 and 1975, which was the year that Amherst took its first women, transfer women, into the college, Amherst hired 17 women. And given the small size of the college and the number of hires we make, that's a lot. And then between 1976, when Amherst took its first class with women students in it, and 1983, another 30 women were hired. So there was an extraordinary amount of hiring of women during those years. The problem was retaining them. So they left for 3 major reasons, one of which was they didn't get reappointed or they didn't get tenure. So judgments were made that their teaching or their scholarship was not up to the quality of what's needed to get tenure here, and they were let go. As one woman pioneer said, I was voted off the island. The second reason was because they didn't stand for tenure. They quit. They got reappointed, and then they decided they weren't happy here, and they quit. Or some of them got to the point of tenure and decided that they weren't going to have a fair hearing of their case, and they quit before tenure and went elsewhere. So, and then there's a third reason, which is more for idiosyncratic personal reasons that women left. So I'm really going to focus on the first two groups, though, those who got turned down for reappointment tenure or who quit. So let me start again with Rose, 1962. It's important to put her back in her historical context. 1962 is pre-women's movement. This is a different world. Sexism takes much more blatant forms than it did in later years. I mean, some of this, what I'm about to tell you, a couple anecdotes about Rose, would be unthinkable in today's world. So first, there's the matter of her rank and her salary. There was a rank that existed back then that doesn't anymore called instructor, and these were people who were still working on their dissertations and didn't have their PhDs yet in hand, and they got hired at the rank of instructor, and then when they finished their PhDs, finished the dissertations, they became assistant professors. Rose Over had finished her PhD and was already teaching at Harvard. Interestingly, she finished her PhD at Harvard but got a degree from Radcliffe because Harvard back then wasn't granting degrees to women. Okay, so she comes as an instructor, and then there's the matter of her salary. Her husband, John, had just gotten hired at UMass in the chemistry department. And the pay scale isn't the same as Amherst pay scale. So the president of the college called up the chair of the chemistry department at UMass to ask what John's salary was set at, so that he could be sure to pay Rose less so as not to upset the stability of her marriage. And for years, she was paid less than all the other men on the faculty until there was a change of presidents, and the new president looked at the salaries and was shocked to find her so much lower than her male colleagues and raised her salary. Then there was the matter of her welcome, a sense of creating a sense of belonging. There was in that day a faculty club, which no longer existed when I got here. And it was an all-male institution and an all-male space. Apparently, wives were not even allowed in. If they wanted to communicate with their husbands in the afternoon, they had to pass notes under the door. And so the board of governors of the faculty club got together to figure out what to do about Rose. They wondered if there was anything in their bylaws that precluded inviting a woman to join. But there was nothing in the bylaws because no one had ever considered that there might ever be a woman teaching at this college. So they were stuck. So here's what they did. They basically had to invite her. So they sent a senior member of the psychology department to Rose to say that they realized they had to invite her, but they sincerely hoped she wouldn't ask to join. Hard invitation to turn down. But here's the irony. Her husband, John, was allowed into the faculty club and used to go there and play bridge in the afternoon, sometimes with Rose's colleagues, even though she wasn't allowed in the space. And then there was the question of how to combine work and family. Now, it's impossible to time your pregnancies perfectly to the academic year, and she got pregnant and gave birth to a child the first week of September. This is right when classes begin. Not a great idea if you had a choice. And she gave birth by cesarean section. She was back in the classroom 3 days later because she realized that her behavior was going to reflect on all women. She was a representative for all women, and she had to show that if they hired a woman could do everything that a man was going to do. Didn't matter what the cost was to her personally. She was there doing it, and she did. Now, I know Rose would not want this to be about her, so that's my stories about Rose. But I will say she did put up with a lot, but she was very grateful to have this job because most of her cohort of women graduate students got research positions. There weren't a lot of tenure-track jobs that were going to women back in 1962. So she was delighted to be here. And I think it's also coming pre-women's movement. I mean, basically, she was an outsider who really devoted herself to working on the inside and working through the existing governance structures to change the college. And as Rick Griffiths, who's in the philosophy department here, put it beautifully in her memorial minute, she was on a 50-year campaign for Amherst. She worked ceaselessly her entire career to make Amherst a better place, both for women and for everyone else. Shout out for Rose. Okay. So let me move on to the next group of women who comes in basically in the 70s. This is a different group of women because they have been influenced by the women's movement. These are women who in graduate school who have been taking part in consciousness-raising groups and have given a lot of thought to gender roles and the roles assigned to men and women, and they're much less accepting of the status quo. So they come in with a different mentality. So let me talk about the challenges that this group of women face. First of all, let me start with teaching. Now, when Rose got here in 1962, there was a required curriculum. And there was a lot of co-teaching with colleagues across departments, and there was also a lot of team-taught courses within departments. And so that socialized new faculty into what the norms were for teaching. And when I gave a talk earlier, I described it as I'd heard it described, verbal swordplay in the classroom. And I just met a man who was a class of '66 who had listened to my talk and said, not exactly, the students didn't have swords, only the professors. He found the teaching style extremely destructive. However, that was the dominant style, and Rose became a master. So there was back then a student-run teaching evaluation system called Scrutiny. For those of you who were here in earlier years, it went on for decades, and they published a little booklet with your teaching evaluations. Some student would write a little essay, and hers said, we went away from the seminar and licked our wounds. So clearly she was doing a good job on the teaching front. But then it got to the early 70s, and Rose had the opportunity to teach with female colleagues from Smith and Mount Holyoke. And what she saw in the classroom was a very different kind of discussion-based course where people put out an idea, and that idea was shaped and crafted by other people. There was none of this kind of, attacking someone and that person defending themselves at all costs. And so her teaching style changed, and she came to be embarrassed by those earlier scrutiny evaluations that she'd gotten from students when she taught in that style. Now, there were a lot of other women who came in the 70s who also were less confrontational and combative in the classroom. The problem was that difference in style that some women brought was seen as a deficiency. It wasn't the same, it was different, it was deficient. And so if women were more nurturing, if women were liked, that was the kiss of death. That meant you weren't challenging enough. You weren't supposed to have those kinds of relationships. In the sciences, women did co-teaching with men. If the students really understood their material, did very well in it, they were told they were teaching the easy material. Now, there also is something that we weren't as aware of in those days, which is there are plenty of studies that show this now, gender biases in teaching evaluations. That even if men and women go into a classroom and do the same thing, women are not seen as competent and knowledgeable as men are. Women are much more likely to have their knowledge challenged in the classroom. But there was no way at the point of tenure when we're evaluating teaching at that point in time to even take into consideration that there might be some biases in the evaluations. Okay, second issue. Women became overburdened with committee service. There was an eagerness on the part of the institution to have women's points of view on the committees, on major committees. There was a study done by the dean in 1981 that looked at committee service, and what the dean found was that 110% of women were serving on committees and 60% of men. In other words, some women are serving on more than one committee, and not every man is serving on a committee. The dean also found that women were serving on major committees earlier in their careers. So again, this is time that is service to the institution, that is time away from other things that are going to be the things that really count towards tenure. And I think it's a way that women were being disadvantaged in a way that men weren't. Then there was the question of mentoring students. A lot of the women who came here in the 70s had a difficult go of it. It was still a pretty male place. And some of those women were really struggling, and they were up against things that don't exist anymore. I mean, I remember clearly a student coming to me and saying, my chemistry professor said no woman can get an A in this course. And some of those women then took science courses at big women's colleges. And then when it came time for the pre-med letters, the men wrote, she took courses off campus because she wasn't up to the rigors of the Amherst curriculum, and then downgraded them in their evaluation of how good a candidate they'd be for medical school. So there were a lot of kind of issues going on here in those days, and women students turned to women faculty who they thought could understand their experiences, validate some of their perceptions. So regardless of who they'd been assigned to as an academic advisor, they sought out women. The problem was, again, this is something I think all of us really enjoy doing here at the college, which is like, counseling students, mentoring students, but it's time consuming, it's draining, and it was one more way that women's time was being sucked into things that weren't going to ultimately count at the point of tenure. Then there's the question of the mentoring of faculty. And I have to say, Amherst has changed enormously over the years. Some people got mentored, some people didn't get mentored. And this is true for men and women. I mean, it was luck of the draw, really. I mean, there was a woman who came back to our symposium who was Ruth Stark, hired in chemistry, 1979. She said the first feedback she got on her teaching was the semester before she came up for tenure. Well, that's a little late if someone has a problem with your teaching. There was a case in the philosophy department, a woman who had a very bad experience around tenure and didn't come back, where it was at the very moment, the beginning of October, when the tenure case goes into the Committee of Six, that her department told her they weren't supporting her for tenure, they had problems with the research. She'd never heard a word about this previous to that. This can't happen anymore. We have all kinds of things in place. But that women were disadvantaged as well as men. But the second thing that I think that was missing for women was having a female mentor, somebody, because women were outsiders to this culture. They didn't have insider knowledge. And I was the only woman at the college in that era who actually had a female mentor, because there was one senior woman on this faculty in 1975 when I arrived, and it was Rose Over, and I came into the psych department, my great good fortune. And I had a person who really was so happy to have another woman in the department and was so believed in me more than I believed in myself, and supported me and did everything she could, getting me research funds and, like anything she could to support me to get tenure. Other women didn't have that. And I'll just share one other story. There was a woman who came back to the symposium who at reappointment was told by the English department she didn't have a snowball's chance in hell to get tenure. Deborah Gewurz, who came here in 1976 in the anthropology department, got elected to the Committee of Six. And after serving on the Committee of Six, she went to this woman in the English department and said, I've seen the tenure process from the other side. I know how things are viewed. I know what's judged. I know what makes a good case. I know what's made a bad case. Here's what we got to do. I'm going to help you put together this case. That woman got tenure. So not all women had that. I think it would have been beneficial to other women to have what I had. I'm still here. And I mean, Rose was an extraordinary person, but I think that made a lot of difference to my own experience here. Okay, let me move on to research. And I'm talking now mostly about people who are in the humanities and the social sciences. I think for a lot of us in that day, with the women's movement, we started looking at our own disciplines differently. And for the first 20 years, for my dissertation, the next 20 years, I looked at issues of gender. And there were women, many women, who were beginning to do, feminist analyses, looking at things in their own discipline through a new lens that hadn't really been used before. So they kind of broke with whatever they were doing in graduate school and started moving in that direction. Now, the thing about this is, if you're doing work that's really novel and breaks with what is convention, it doesn't necessarily go into the top journal, because that journal may be more conservative and not accepting that kind of work. But at the point of tenure, when we make judgments about quality of work, what journal that got published in carries a lot of weight. And if it's a top-tier journal, then that work is deemed excellent in a way that it isn't if it's in a lesser journal. And the second thing is, when we judge people's work at the point of tenure, we get outside letters from scholars in the field who will write in support or do an evaluation. They get all your written work and they do an evaluation of it. We give a lot of weight to letters from people at the top research institutions who we know. And if a top scholar in the field is not at one of those institutions, that person is not someone we know, they're more suspect. So at this point, we have no women in gender studies department. Many schools don't have this yet. There came to be well-established journals that publish this kind of work. So some of these women were really disadvantaged at the point of tenure in terms of the ways that we made decisions, how we judged the letters that came in. They carried a lot more weight if they came from the traditional scholar who said this is heresy than if they came from somebody who said this is brilliant. And some of these women went on to become nationally known for their feminist scholarship, but we judged it negatively. And that actually, the first tenure case like that went badly in the philosophy department influenced some of these other women who quit before the point of tenure because they felt that they really didn't have a shot at it. Now, the other thing is there were a few women back in that day who were doing research in fields, areas of the world that we deemed not so important. There was a woman who studied Brazilian literature, someone in history studying Southeast Asia. These are areas of the world that are now coming more centrally into our curriculum. But at that point, America, Western Europe, that was the center of the world for us. And some of these other areas, who cared about Brazilian literature? I mean, that was kind of the attitude. So that also kind of, I think, counted against some women in their tenure decisions. Now, the first women had difficulties not just because of gender, but also because of the intersection of gender with some of their other social identities. In specific, if we take a look at age, they were at a disadvantage not just because they were women, but also because they were very young. At that point in the 60s and 70s, people were more likely to go right on to graduate school, finish in a shorter amount of time, and come straight to a job. So a lot of these pioneer women, they were in their mid-20s. They were barely older than our students. And it is harder when you're coming into a faculty of distinguished teachers and scholars, who've been at their work for decades and have much more knowledge and experience, to see yourself as equal to them. Likewise, it's hard for the men to see women, whatever bias they may have about women to begin with. No woman can get an A, but when they're also that young and vulnerable in terms of their careers, and also in terms of students. Would you rather have the senior male teaching your section or this new woman who may not know anything as far as you're concerned? Okay, so that counted against them. I think Amherst came to realize, and we had the dean who was there, Mary Catherine Bates in the 80s, really felt that it was a mistake to integrate the institution from the bottom up, everybody hired at a junior level in terms of women, that it would have been advantageous to be making some senior hires of women as well. But that's something we didn't, she ultimately was able to make one senior hire, but that wasn't something that Amherst did back then. It really hired at the junior level. Women were also multiply marginalized, had a problem if they didn't come in from the top graduate schools, because that is where most of the faculty was hired from before we ever really advertised positions. And so if you came in from the top graduate schools, and most of the pioneer women did, they were hired out of the very top research institutions in this country, you kind of got a pass, like, okay, you must be smart, you went to Harvard, you went to Yale. But women who came in from lesser institutions didn't get a pass, and they felt that, much more vulnerable, and that they had to prove that they were smart and that they knew what they were doing. And then there are all the women who didn't fit what was then the demographic norm. And this is because they were people of color. There weren't too many of those. Because they were gay. People were not openly gay back then. There were gay women on campus. They were pretty private about their personal lives. Because they were working class, most of the faculty weren't from working class backgrounds. Because they were Jewish, because they came from lower income families. Any woman who fit any of those demographics had a harder time fitting into this institution, into this social world, and making a place for herself here. So I'm just saying, it's not just that they were women, it's the multiple marginalization based on intersection with a number of other identities that made things hard for women. Then there were the problems of combining work and family life. It would take a long time for a maternity leave policy to be passed. That wasn't until 1979. But there's the perennial problem of timing your pregnancies, which of course you can't really do. And then there's how your department accepts a woman being pregnant. So a woman came back to the symposium who was the first one to take a maternity leave once the policy went in place, and she announced to the English department that she was pregnant with her second child. She announced it in a department meeting. Dead silence. Then one senior man said, "Well, now we see. One time could have been an accident, but 2 shows it was on purpose." A bit chilling. Okay, there were many women who felt that they couldn't take a maternity leave after the policy was put in place. because they felt that their departments would think they weren't serious about their careers, they weren't serious about their scholarships, about their scholarship. And so even after the policy was there, it's as if we didn't have the policy because a lot of women wouldn't take it. I still remember the discussion on the floor of the faculty about whether the tenure clock should stop when you took a maternity leave. This is when the whole policy was under consideration. And there were men who felt you were completely healthy. Of course the tenure clock shouldn't stop, because women could have child after child after child and get semester after semester after semester towards tenure that men didn't have. Like, this was such an unfair advantage that women could just keep having children and, and get all these semesters off. So absolutely not. No stopping the tenure clock when this policy was first voted in. Okay, then there's the question, once you had these children, how do you take care of them? There was no daycare center until 1986. By that time, Amherst had hired over 50 women. There was no daycare center when I had my children, but I can see where it's very convenient for a nursing mother to be able to just pop over, nurse during the day, whatever, but that didn't exist. But then there's the other thing, is that this college had a schedule that was set up in certain ways based on a much earlier model of the one career family where the husband is working here and he's got a wife at home. And so late afternoon meetings are perfectly fine because your wife is going to pick up the children and make dinner. And faculty meetings in the evening are perfectly fine because you've got someone home that's taking care of the children. But that became more complicated for women who didn't necessarily have a husband at home that was doing those things. And I do remember this, right after I got tenure, I gave birth to my second child. And I came off maternity leave and I got immediately put on, which was typical for the day, you got put on a major committee if you're a woman. So I got put on the Committee on Educational Policy, which is a major workload committee. And when I got asked to serve on this committee, I was told it met Wednesday, 4 to 6. And my husband worked late one night at the Worcester Youth Guidance Center, and it was Wednesday. And here I had a baby, I had a 3-year-old. I'm supposed to have this 4 to 6 meeting. I'm thinking, this is not ideal for me. Of course I could get a babysitter, but I didn't want to do that. I'm at college all day long. This is ridiculous. So I said to the dean, I'd be delighted to serve, but I wondered if the meeting could be held at a different time. And I was told, make arrangements. So I did. I called up the chair of the committee and I said, would it be possible for this committee to meet at another time? And he's like, of course. And we did. And I don't know if that had been its traditional meeting time for years, but I don't know if it ever went back to it. I think that with the 3 years I was on it, it didn't meet 4 to 6. Because why should it? If it's not convenient, why should it? Okay. But there were many things in place in terms of the way the thing ran that was built on a world that was no more. Okay, now let me just say this. The experience of women really varied depending on what department they were in. And so everyone didn't universally have a bad experience or a good experience. The women who had the hardest time were in the sciences. And they were slow to hire women and they were slow to tenure women. In 1984, there were 4 women in the physical sciences. That was it. 84, math hired its first woman. She lasted 3 years and left. In 1992, physics hired its first woman. She didn't get tenure. In biology and chemistry, they had serial hires. Hire a woman, turn her down for tenure. Hire another woman, turn her down for tenure. Hire another woman, turn her down for tenure. That went on for decades in biology and in chemistry. Okay, so we got to 1983, and a committee got together, and they issued a report in 84 on the conditions of work for women, and they made a number of recommendations, some of which went into effect, one of which was the establishment of a daycare center, which opened in 86, one of which was the establishment of a Women and Gender Studies department, which also started up in 86. One of which was they extended the time to tenure from 6 years to 7, feeling like these were people who were having children during those years, that an extra year for everybody to tenure would be helpful. And also, it was up to the woman to decide if she wanted to stop the tenure clock during those years. There was also one senior. It was recommended that instead of hiring all at the junior level, a senior hire was made. More would have been useful, but one senior hire was made. Okay, So let me move on from here and then just talk about the parallels in terms of these issues. I'm just going to go through the list again in terms of the applications for, to hiring faculty of color. Let's start with teaching. In terms of teaching style, if faculty of color bring a different teaching style, the risk is whether that style may be seen because it is different as deficient. Something's wrong with it. And we know now, we already know, there's a whole literature on racial bias in teaching evaluations that black professors in particular are seen as less knowledgeable and competent than white professors, so that if these evaluations, black professors are more likely to be challenged in the classroom, even if they do the same thing as white professors. So this is something we know, it's something we have to take into consideration in judging people at the point of tenure. In terms of committee service, this is the same issue that existed for women. We're eager to have faculty of color on our committees, their points of view, on our search committees to attract other people of color to this college. But there aren't that many to go around, and there are a lot of committees, and so we risk overburdening them. I worry personally, not just about the junior faculty, about the senior faculty. In terms of service to this college in that way, in terms of the amount of committees they serve on. So again, this is not something that's going to count very much at the point of tenure. And the issue of mentoring students is exactly parallel. Just as the first women who came here in the 70s were struggling in a lot of ways, making this institution work for themselves and being up against a lot of sexism, we have really gone the distance in changing the student body in terms of bringing in many more students of color. 45% of the American students here are students of color, and there are even more if you count the international students. And some of them are having a hard time here, as you know, if you follow the Amherst Uprising last fall, some of the discontent on campus. Those students, regardless of who they're assigned to as academic advisors, turn to the faculty of color as people who can possibly best understand their experiences, that can best validate their perceptions, that can best be advocates in their attempts to change this institution. So again, this is a part of the work, getting to know students, working with students, supporting students that faculty here love, but it's time consuming, it's draining, and taking care of a lot of people who are having a hard time of it. And it's something we have to be concerned about in terms of where the time is going from faculty of color. In terms of the issue of mentoring, Amherst is way, better placed than it was when I was first here, because now we have, thanks to our dean and we have systems in place that everyone is getting evaluated on their teaching every semester and in their research every year. There's no getting to the point of tenure and all of a sudden being told that there's something wrong where you haven't had a lot of feedback and your choice about whether you want to do things differently. It's your choice, but you're going to have all that feedback, so that can't happen anymore. But the thing that is still parallel is it is useful for faculty of color here to have senior people on the faculty, again, who are insiders, who understand things about what it's like for a person of color to be in this predominantly white faculty, who understand, there's an issue faculty of color face that isn't something that women face, which is how do you fit into this town? We have a good public school system, but not a great public school system in terms of if you ask people of color what the experience of their children are there. So who has that insider information? That is going to be people of color. And Amherst has made a few senior hires of color, which I think is fantastic, and has been advised that we need to do more of this, not just bring in people at the junior level as we did with women. Now, again, like women, minority faculty have a hard time also because of the intersection with other social identities, like age. We bring them in right out of graduate school. Then they're going to be the youngest people here. You already have racial biases in terms of our evaluations. And on top of that, if you're younger and you don't have the years of experience and you don't have the years of knowledge, then you've just got more ways that you're going to be viewed negatively. And again, not fitting the demographic norm. If you are from a working class family, if you are single, if you are single parenting, this isn't the norm. You're going to have a harder time fitting into the existing structures and social life of this college. And then last thing, and then I'm going to stop. which is the question of the problems of integrating work and family life. Things have come a long way in that respect. We've got a daycare center, we've got a maternity leave policy, you can stop the clock, all those wonderful things. I have to say, though, that from my perspective, the demands on faculty have slowly escalated over the years, because as we have a more complicated student body, more time is going into taking care of those students. There's just more demands on faculty than there were in the past. I mean, when I first was here, we had weed out courses. You know, you took organic chemistry, you did badly, goodbye, do something else, you're not going to be a doctor. Now there's more of an obligation. How are we going to help these students who might have come in underprepared make it through these courses? That's a lot more work on the part of faculty. If you have a student with disabilities, how are you going to make this work for that student? So there are a lot of things now in terms of, you know, people who are underprepared. I mean, I had a student from Vietnam in my freshman seminar, you know, comes in when I signed the first paper, and she said, "What's a paper?" Because no one asks you in Vietnam what you think, and you're supposed to write some essay. No, it's all tests. So you've got students. She's brilliant. This girl, like, end of the semester, worked so hard with the Writing Center, saw me about every paper. She wrote A papers. But meanwhile, that's like, it takes some work to get people there. They can get there, but it's just, I'm saying there's more and more. So all I can say is every hour you're putting into the college more is 1 hour out of this fixed sum of hours you've got. And I'm now mentoring someone from outside of my department. She hardly has time to see her husband. So if you add more and more demands, it's hard. I think it's really hard still to have a balance of, you know, work and family. So anyway, in conclusion, these are just some thoughts about mistakes we made with women, with the early women, and, you know, having such poor retention of them. And I just hope that, you know, by looking back at some of this history, we can be more aware of things and do a better job in retaining the faculty that we're now hiring.